From the beautiful city of Los Angeles, California, we bring you the Gimme Three Podcast. Hello and welcome, cinephiles, cinema lovers, movie appreciators, friends and family, to the Gimme Three Podcast, a series for cinephiles. This is a show where we pick three films based on one theme. I'm Nicholas Ybarra, co-host of the Gimme Three Podcast. Bella and I are taking this week off to prepare a bunch of great episodes to round out the year for you, which starts next week, where we're going to be doing a spotlight episode on Demi Moore. Since if you listen a couple episodes back to our horror films directed by women part 1, it was clear that our guest Jess McLaughlin and Bella needed a little bit of schooling on the great Demi Moore and how much of a badass she is. So we are going to do that next week, a Demi Moore spotlight episode. So don't miss that. This week, let's see, what is going on this week? Is there anything big happening? Anything of note? Nothing is coming to mind. Oh well, anyway, here is a totally random re-release of an episode I did with my buddy David Chiu in January of 2021. I just picked this one at random, so please enjoy. And what was I going to say? Oh yeah, please go vote. Vote, vote, vote. Anyways, I'm being cheeky. Enjoy the episode. Gimme Three Presidential Films. And now if you're saying to yourselves at home, wow, what a great idea, Nick. Where do you come up with this stuff? I'd say to you, it was not my idea, not my brilliant concept, this one. But it was a returning guest, and I'm just going to call you a Gimme Three master now, Mr. David Chiu. David, welcome back to Film Forward, and I'm enjoying making this a habit.
Oh, me too. This is way more fun than I imagined it would be. And given how much I like talking about movies, I expected it to be fun. So, and I am so happy to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to have you back. So you came up with this concept. We started working on this episode before January 6th, I believe. So it's been kind of fun and remarkable, enlightening and informative to watch and prep this episode over the last month or so. It's been a scary few weeks, obviously, but hopefully this episode will help our audience make sense of some stuff. If not, at least entertain you, which I think everybody can use some entertainment these days.
Yeah. I should also add, I'm maybe pulling back the curtain a bit, but we're actually recording this episode before the inauguration. So I really hope everything went by the time you're hearing this, I really hope it all went really well.
Yes.
And everything is good. So
it's literally the night before the inauguration. In about 13 hours, Biden will get inaugurated. Hopefully, we pray an uneventful and beautiful inauguration, and we can move forward with our lives.
Right, exactly. So I'm just going to record this podcast assuming that you're not releasing it into a Mad Max hellscape.
Right.
But, it sounds like a joke, but, that fur horn costume made me really think, man, I guess we really are finally dressing for the apocalypse now.
Here you go. That's me knocking on wood right there.
Right.
Okay, so we're just going to dive right in, Mr. Chiu. I'm going to have you start us off again, and this is Gimme Three Presidential Films. Your first one is?
When we first came up with this, as you mentioned, I had said this would be limited to both presidents, real and fictional.
Yes.
And so that's a point of clarification. So my first film is about a fictional president, a theoretical scenario in which one part of the government tries to stage a coup on another part of the government, which at the time was a really a little bit of an imaginative concept. Obviously, I picked this movie before January 6th, so it's very strange to now really think about it in light of those events. It certainly changed my reading of it. But it was born out of some real anxieties. And actually, I think we're going to get into some of those anxieties as a result of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is 7 Days in May, directed by the fantastic thriller director John Frankenheimer and written by one of my favorite writers of all time, who I actually wrote a biographical film about that's currently making the rounds around Hollywood. Rod Serling, creator of The Twilight Zone. People don't know this about Rod Serling because they think of him as a sci-fi guy. He was not a sci-fi guy. He was actually a drama guy. And when he went to do The Twilight Zone, there's a famous interview with him and Mike Wallace, who sort of said, "Hey, Rod, are you selling out by doing this sci-fi stuff?" Little did anybody realize that Rod Serling that would become what he was known for. But he was actually a drama guy. And you can really see it in this film. The scripting is crackling. It is fast-paced. The dialogue is crisp. It rings off the ear. The characters are sharply drawn. The moral dilemmas are human and intense. And it basically tells the story of a fictional president, President Lyman, who is trying to push through a treaty through the Senate that he apparently has the votes lined up for. It's a treaty he signed with the Soviet Union where both of them are going to ban nuclear weapons, both mutual disarmament. And the military believes that the president is being hoodwinked by the Soviet Union, that the Soviets will not honor their end of the treaty, and America will unilaterally disarm and then find itself at the mercy of the Soviet Union. And so Kirk Douglas plays the assistant to a charismatic chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General James Mathune Scott, as they like to call him. And he is this charismatic politician, figure who is starting to really edge into politician territory. He's theoretically just the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's supposed to be above politics, but it is clear from a speech he gives, from sharing his opinion in the committee, that he's clearly has eyes on the presidency himself. And he's handsome and he's charismatic. However, as Kirk Douglas starts to uncover, his boss isn't going to do this by running for president conventionally and doing it through the electoral process. He begins to realize that there's a coup in motion, and that even though he is devoted to his boss and he believes in him, he realizes he can't go more along with this morally, and actually begins to realize that this coup is at the highest levels of all the military apparatus of the U.S. government. So he goes to the president, and I'm spoiling sort of the first beginning part of the movie, but and he goes to President Lyman, and he alerts them to this coup. And unfortunately, because the president is really unpopular right now, he doesn't feel like he could just go out and fire the Joint Chiefs and say there's a coup and all that. The public won't believe it. It'll divide the country. And so instead, it becomes almost like a mystery thriller where they have to kind of see, can they get evidence? What are they up to? Can we prove it's a coup? Can we figure out who's in on it? Can we avoid it? And so it becomes half mystery, half game of cat and mouse. And it's just a crackling political thriller. And it just buzzes along until it really reaches a very powerful and very slam-bang conclusion. And it was born out of really a sense of that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the military was pretty contemptuous of Jack Kennedy. They saw him as this young kid who was in over his head. And there was a sense of real defiance. It never got to any sort of coup. Yeah. But it reflected anxieties, I think, that Rod Serling and the country was feeling about the growth and power of the military. I mean, it's worth noting that prior to World War II, the American military was not the juggernaut that it is now. Yeah. I mean, Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned about the military-industrial complex for a reason. This had happened in his lifetime. It happened as a result of World War II and the Cold War. So I think in the 60s, America looked at itself in the mirror and said, whoa, we've created something really powerful that has a mind of its own. And you can really see these anxieties play out in 7 Days in May.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. And it's the film starts off just like gangbusters. The first scene, it's like there's combating protests happening in front of the White House. The country's kind of in shambles, and it just ends in like a fisticuffs riot between these two groups. And in a way, it was like both refreshing and horrifying to watch it in 2021 and watch this movie that I think does it take place in the 50s, right?
I
Even though
think
it's made
it
in
was
64.
65. Yeah, I'm not sure when it takes. Yeah, it might be. It was 60. It was 64, 65. I think.
Yeah, it came out in 64. So, anyways, obviously, this is a fictional film, but it was just like, not much has changed.
Well, you know what's funny? In that opening scene, watching it, I saw it after the Capitol riot situation, funnily enough. You know, like all these movies, if I saw them, I went back and rewatched them because I wanted them to be fresh. And I watched this movie, and at first, there's a simmering tension between the two camps of protesters that are walking past each other silently with opposite signs.
Right.
You know, either we should ban the bomb or we should, don't disarm. And my first thought was, wow, these people are way too calm. And then they break out into this fight. And it was almost refreshing. I thought like, oh, you had that too.
Right. Yeah.
So I thought it was in a weird way. I felt like heartened. I'm like, oh, okay, well, you made it. You made it. Even though you had this problem, you still made it okay. So maybe we'll make it okay. It was such a weird reaction.
For sure. No, I felt the same way. Like you said, the script is just amazing, and the themes that it touches on that predict a lot of where the country is going to go. Just this, fear and power hungry men are a theme that are going to be persistent in a lot of the films that we're going to talk about in this episode, which was unintentional. It was just something that came up in almost every movie in a very overt way. And it started with this one. I also love that in this script, General Scott goes through all of these hoops and makes sure all his T's are crossed and his I's are dotted, and like all of this rigmarole and this elaborate plan to make this coup even possible and to keep it under, and just like seeing what the attempted and failed coup on the 6th is like, if you handed me a script 10 years ago of what happened, I would be like, well, this is stupid. This is completely unrealistic. You mean these people are just going to walk into the Capitol? Like that would, come on. Not even in the wildest imaginations of screenwriters and fairy tale makers, none of that would have ever happened. It's just too easy, and good God.
Right. It's so true. They really have to sell you on how this is. They have to do a really slow burn.
Yeah.
And it's not a slow movie, but I mean, they have to walk you into the idea of the coup in 7 Days in May because they know you're just not going to buy it. Now, like you said, it was so preposterous what really happened. But it was like, wait, it was just a bunch of guys, some of which like dressed in like furs and wearing, crazy costumes were gonna charge the Capitol. I mean, and the president's whole scheme just rests on asking the vice president to do something he doesn't have the constitutional power to do. Is like, that can't be that can't be it. That can't be the whole coup. But
it was.
It was.
Before we move on, I just want to mention Kirk Douglas is incredible in this movie, as he is in most movies. Yeah. But he is a movie star, man. Movie star. And he's just in so many anti-war movies. I just love that he made that, one of his career staples. Like he's in 2 of my favorite like anti-war movies, this and Paths of Glory.
Also, I got to give a shout out to Ava Gardner fantastically. Plays basically the other woman, like at some point, again, what a world we live in. Kirk Douglas discovers that Ava Gardner is the mistress of his boss who's trying to stage the coup. And the president debates whether to use this against him, and it would bring him down in a moment. But in the end decides that, no, I can't do this. It's immoral. And like, he's literally trying to protect the country from the end of democracy. And he's like, I can't use this guy's affair against him. It's so strange to get to hear it, to see it now. Post Bill Clinton, post Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels.
Right.
And to think not only is the idea that like somebody would hesitate to use that as preposterous, but the idea that would even threaten anybody's presidency is also preposterous.
Right.
But what's really daring for that time period is she's kind of the love interest, even though she's the woman, quote unquote, from the wrong side of the tracks. You get the sense that she's sultry. I think she wears a lot of black, and it's a black and white movie, but she's not in the David Lynch film, she's definitely the brunette versus the blonde, that kind of iconography of cinema. And yet the film kind of hints that like, maybe there could be something between her and Kirk Douglas's character. Like she's the love interest. And that's pretty daring I feel like for a 60s movie. I mean, it would be daring now, I would even say.
100%. I feel like she's in a weird way with the most human character in the movie too. Yeah, 7 Days in May. It is an incredible watch. I recommend everybody check it out, especially after what we went through January 6th. It is definitely a fascinating and intriguing, and in a weird, it's like I said, it's both horrifying and comforting to watch this movie now through the scope of 2021. But check it out. It's available to rent wherever you get your streaming platforms. I personally rented it at Cinephile Video, which is located on Santa Monica Boulevard in West LA, right next to the New Art Theater. Give your rental store some love. There's good people over there, and keep them in business because they need the love.
And they stock movies you can't find anywhere else.
Oh, yes.
Anywhere. So really, they are a local treasure.
100%. If you live in Los Angeles or if you're passing through Los Angeles, check them out. Cinephile Video. Thousands and thousands of hidden gems and big movies that can be for rent or for sale. I'm moving on to my first pick, and we're, like you said, we're sticking kind of with the same theme. We did not plan to connect our films the way that they connect, but it was just, I don't know, serendipitous, or maybe we're just starting to get kind of in sync. I don't know what's happening, but
I know. It's like when people start to look like their pets or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's like a weird synergy happening. Yeah.
So my first film is 13 Days, which is about, the worst part about 13 Days is the lame title. 13 Days is about, drumroll, the 13 days surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the film follows, in particular, President John F. Kennedy, his brother, then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and JFK's right-hand man, Kenny O'Donnell. And much like the last film that we just discussed, 7 Days in May, the president is combating, this perceived weakness. There's an alert that missiles are being exported from Russia and on their way to Cuba. And every single one of, not every single one, but most of the advisors that President John F. Kennedy has are telling him that they need to take aggressive action immediately and essentially bomb Cuba or bomb the ships that are bringing these missiles from Russia. And, John F. Kennedy and his brother, they want to find a peaceful way to solve this crisis. That's a little backstory if you don't know what the Cuban Missile Crisis is. And if you do know what the Cuban Missile Crisis is, I still recommend watching this film because it is pretty thorough and really lays everything out in a way that is concise but holistic, and all the while very, very gripping. This is a movie, like all caps, capital MOVIE movie. Big score, big sets, big acting, big nuts, big everything. It's like, like those late 90s, early 2000s big president movie. It's like Air Force One kind of, but this is about a real president. I hadn't seen this movie since, it came out, and I think it came out in the year 2000. And it's just a great popcorn movie, but you also learn a lot and it uplifts you. With all the films that we're going to talk about, you'll see politics in action. You'll see lobbying in action. This movie is like diplomacy in action. And that is exhilarating to watch.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It's both it and 7 Days in May are these really fast-paced. Like you said, it's interesting. It does feel like a product of the 90s, and that like there's all this like these sequences in between, the cutting from the presidential suite, from the White House Situation Room or the Oval Office, will cut to like military planes being loaded and missiles being launched and warships. And I was like, man, what is the budget for this? Like, I feel like if you made this movie now, it'd be like an HBO movie. They would have cut all that military stuff out for budget reasons, and it would mostly be a series of offices. And not only the idea that they put all this money into this really grown-up movie, right? It's about ideas and politics, but they had this belief that like a movie like this could afford a budget like this. There was a demand among the American movie-going public for a really sophisticated drama with a serious budget behind it. I mean, it sort of says something really lovely about America.
It says something really lovely about America, and it says something about Hollywood then as opposed to now. Like now, like I mean, if it's not a Marvel movie or a Disney movie, like you're not getting $30-40 million.
Yeah,
back
the
then,
mid-range
like,
drama really suffered.
Good movie. We're gonna give it a hell of money.
Yeah.
Watching this movie, the thought I kept having to myself was, being the president is such an unbelievably hard job.
Yeah.
Because there are so many moments in this film and in this moment in history, particularly, where you think there really wasn't a good choice while he's going through this, putting yourself in his shoes, day after day. And he was fighting to try and not escalate this thing, which is so admirable. But at the same time, there's huge risks on both sides. Both sides present huge risks. There's even a line of dialogue where JFK says, if they want this goddamn job, they can have it because it brings me no joy. And you're just like, yeah, it would probably bring you no joy to have to. How do you sleep? How do you sleep at night knowing you just millions of lives are in your hands? And if you make the wrong choice, which is easy to do, people will die.
Yeah, I mean, there was a moment, by the way, JFK is played amazingly by Bruce Greenwood.
He's fantastic.
Such a great JFK.
It's the best JFK I've ever seen.
I think so. He's really good. There's this moment where it just suddenly hits you that he knows that he has all these, like you said, no good choices, all bad choices. And he literally knows that if he makes the wrong move, the world will end. Like thermonuclear war will result. Yeah. Like that's what the stakes is. People really believed at the time, and I think they're right, but they knew, like the whole country knew, the whole world knew that we were on the brink of world-ending nuclear war. And that was really terrifying, right? And the idea that, can you imagine sitting there knowing that and having to make these choices? And the interesting thing, too, is at some point they're like, well, you need to keep up appearances. We can't let the secret out. So just go to all these, silly political events. and finally he says, tell everybody I have a cold. I'm not going to do this stuff anymore.
That's right. They were tell you, no, you got to keep your schedule because if you don't show up to this, public speaking event, the country's going to know something's up.
Right. So yeah, it reminded me of Obama making jokes at the White House Correspondents' Dinner the day before they killed Osama bin Laden.
Right. Can you imagine what must have been on his mind? It's like, Jesus
Christ. Right. And I mean, and Seth Meyers made a joke about them not being able to find bin Laden. And if you look at Obama's face, he laughs. And I thought, wow, that is a great acting. That is maybe some of the finest acting I've ever seen. Because Obama, he doesn't let on at all.
Yeah.
That there is oh, we know where he is, and we're about to send in the Navy SEALs, right? And knowing that he can't let it out, right? That would ruin the surprise. Like you said, it gave me an appreciation for the presidency. There's a moment where Bobby Kennedy and Kenny O'Donnell are in the car together, and Bobby Kennedy's at various points, he and his brother are I don't know why I want this. This is a terrible job. And Kenny O'Donnell says, oh, we thought we could do a better job than anybody else. That's why we did it. We did it because we really thought we would add something to it. And I thought, yeah, that's really true. If you sign up for that job, you are basically saying, out of all the people in the country, I'm the best person to make these incredibly terrifying life or death, world-ending decisions. It was surreal to come across it after a president who could not seem to care less about the awesome responsibilities of his job.
I'm just going to mention the final shot of this movie.
Oh, breaks your heart.
After the deal is, I won't. For those who don't know what happens in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or for those,
the world doesn't end with a nuclear Armageddon.
Diplomacy triumphs, and Bobby and John and Kenny, they're all, having a attaboy pat on the back, and they kind of walk away, and the camera does a slow pan over to the White House wall, and the men cross through the shadows. We see their shadows crossing, and the shadow of John F. Kennedy looks like John F. Kennedy is walking away into the sunset, and it's just mwah, chef's kiss.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful final shot. Again, capital MOVIE
right.
movie. It is a movie ending.
It reminds me of the place that a lot of people said Lincoln should have ended, the Steven Spielberg Lincoln, where there's that shot where he walks out of the hallway and he kind of loses focus. And I know a lot of people were like, stop it there. It's the perfect end shot.
Right.
And regardless of whether you think they should have or not, it reminded me of the same idea of the character just walks back into myth. Right.
Yeah.
And that's really what the film was. Like, as we'll see from some of the other films that deal with some of the other historical presidents, that like they take a much less rose-colored glasses look at the figures that they're looking at. But Kennedy, he still has this magical power over the country, for a guy who really was president for a very short time. Sadly, he was assassinated.
My grandma, she loves JFK so much. She has a picture of JFK on her bedroom wall. Pretty big.
Yeah. The power he held. And, I do think there is something to be said about him as the first Catholic president. Was even for people who weren't Catholics, he was very popular. Rod Serling loved him. He was very popular among the Jewish population in the same way that Obama even had a certain hold over people who weren't necessarily African Americans, but who saw that as a groundbreaking moment, as a sense that this country, that anything was possible.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of just who he was and what he represented as being, he was this new generation. He was somebody who overcame anti-Catholic prejudice to become the president. Now we have another Catholic as president, but, it's hardly anybody thinks about it. It's not unusual or strange because Kennedy already broke down that barrier. There's sort of a power that he holds in American history. And this film definitely has this sense, especially that last shot, of what Kennedy means in our national saga to a lot of people. Like you said, like your grandmother.
Absolutely. 13 Days. It's a wonderful popcorn film and a beautiful history lesson. It's a great watch. Check it out. Again, available to rent on all streaming platforms. And again, check it out. Cinephile Video, your local library. It is available to the masses, and it's a great watch. All right, so Mr. Chiu, your second film, our next two films, again,
weirdly synchronized.
Was not on purpose.
Not on purpose.
Not planned, but your second film. Go ahead and start it off.
Well, if our first two films were our Cuban Missile Crisis films, this is the embittered former President Nixon film pairing. And my film is Secret Honor, Robert Altman's very curious production.
Yeah.
It's really one actor playing Richard Nixon, who is wandering around basically a single set. Just looks like kind of an office, but weirdly enough has paintings of various presidents and Henry Kissinger on the wall. I'm not quite sure why.
And his mother.
And his mother. That makes a little bit more sense. That I can understand having a picture of your mom. Yeah. Weirdly, having a painting of Henry Kissinger on your wall is a little strange, even if he was your Secretary of State. But it was filmed on a shoestring budget at the University of Michigan, I feel like, in Ann Arbor. And he just got like a bunch of like communication students to kind of work for. Can you imagine, by the way, being like going to school and be like, "Oh yeah, do you want to go be crew for Robert Altman?"
Right.
I mean, this is post Nashville, I think, and post MASH. It's like really legendary.
Robert Altman. A lot of his big, this came out in 1982, I think.
And it's funny, I think you still get the sense it's a bit of a risky move. Like there's this long preamble that says, look, this isn't based on anything real. The thing it's called Secret Honor, a political myth.
Yeah.
So they're still like, I guess, a little nervous about how it's going to come across. And it's a weird movie. Like there's no other actors. Richard Nixon seems to have security cams installed all over his place, including in the room watching himself, which is very odd. The actor kind of looks like Philip Baker Hall, who's an incredible performance. Like kind of looks like Nixon and kind of sounds like Nixon, but not completely. And he's going off in these weird tangents and rambling things. And he talks about conspiracy theories, including the Bohemian Grove, which is this shadowy group supposedly of oligarchs who, I mean, it's a real like retreat. But it's been the subject of a lot of like conspiracy theorists that this committee of 100 and these shadowy group powerful figures, of which Richard Nixon really did belong to, this group called the Bohemian Grove, as did Ronald Reagan, were secretly like behind all of this. It's a very odd film. And I think it's based on a story that in his final night in the White House before he resigned, Richard Nixon was roaming the halls yelling, at paintings of other presidents on the wall. It's an anecdote that's been sort of passed down into legend. And I think it inspired the film. So, because even though the film takes place long after his time in the White House, I mean, the fact that he spends a lot of time like yelling at paintings of former presidents on the wall, as if they were there to confront him.
With Nixon, it's like there's this chip on his shoulder. He grew up from humble beginnings. He wanted to be respected. He wanted to be taken seriously, and he had some tough defeats. in his early political career, and he had some like really dark family tragedy early in his life.
Yeah.
So he's like always trying to push himself and get himself over this hump, and just to prove that he could, and to prove to the, elites, which in this film, Philip Baker Hall is just like, it's a tirade on the elite motherfuckers who do not like respect him or who never respected him. And he wants to prove to them that he was the president and he did right.
Yeah.
So there's that element that makes him very fascinating. And you can tell like that's what also kind of made him relatable, and why so many people voted for him was because there's a lot of people like that who, feel like they've got something to prove, that feel like they've got a chip on their shoulder. And if you work hard and do the right thing, that you can do anything.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're revisiting that theme of power and power hungry men. Once they get that power, then the power kind of takes control, and then it goes downhill from there.
Yeah.
But,
as you say this, I realize that anti-elite, like part of the problem, reason we're in this situation with the coronavirus is there's been such suspicion sowed about scientists and, whoever the perceived elites are. There's an anti-intellectualist strain, that we see it with climate change denial and all of this stuff. And Nixon, in some ways, you can see this too. Like you said, like he certainly he was brilliant. I don't think he was anti-intellectual at all. And this film presents him as very cultured. But, that he was an outsider among all these people from blue bloods in Ivy League schools. And here he was, from the middle of I've been to his this tiny little house where he grew up in. And it's in the Nixon Library in Southern California. And, he was always an outsider to those people. And I think he, like you said, he always had a chip on his shoulder for it. And I think that's why he tapped into a lot of Americans who also knew that, like, hey, we will never be part of the establishment, so screw them all.
Right.
I also have to say, part of the reason I picked this movie is I don't know if Donald Trump, like Richard Nixon, will ever face any earthly justice for the things he's done. People excitedly imagine, who don't like Trump, that he'll, see the inside of a prison cell or whatnot. I'm not sure that'll ironic for a guy who chanted "lock her up" toward his
right
opponent. I don't know if that'll take place, but arguably, what this film shows is that Richard Nixon, as Robert Altman imagines him, is in a prison of his own mind.
100%.
And that's the justice that really he does get. And that's the justice I honestly feel that probably, this is obvious from this podcast, I'm not a fan of the 45th president, how I imagine that Donald Trump is going to spend his post-presidency yelling at the wall and, bitter and angry and reliving his past defeats and his past glories, but not in a way that gives him pleasure, but in a way that only makes him feel more wounded. And, the irony is the person who's doing that to him is himself.
100%. I really love this film so much that before you picked it, I watched it actually. Before you sent me as your pick, because I was just like imbibing presidential movies, and I watched this and I was like, what? This is bananas.
It really is.
Since that time when I first watched, I've watched it twice since.
Really?
Because it's just, it gets like more interesting, and there's more to dissect each time you watch it, because I mean, like, your mind is racing because he's talking a mile a minute, and he's going, like you mentioned, he's going on all these tangents and telling histories of his life and, accusing other people who've wronged him and this and that. So your mind's kind of like dissecting it all, going through the history yourself, putting yourself in his shoes, thinking about Trump and all this kind of stuff. So watching it multiple times is really fascinating. There's a few things I just want to call out about the movie before we move on. You mentioned Philip Baker Hall kind of looks like Nixon, kind of doesn't. When the film camera moves to the monitors, that he's got like a video camera pointed at him, and he's got like these 4 television monitors watching him. When the camera's looking at those monitors, it's uncanny. He looks like Nixon, and it's like really scary. And then there's other shots where the camera's looking at him through the reflection of these windows, and he's got his like arms raised up in triumph as he's reading quotes from his memoir. And it's just like, it's chilling. Again, this is a fictional movie, but it was just, it really gets your heart racing, like watching some of those stuff, because through the lens of the monitor, through the pixelated monitors, and through the reflection, it really looks like him.
Let me ask you something. I'm really curious. What do you think that was about? I mean, that was my pick. That's the one thing I've never been, I haven't quite cracked yet. I've been thinking it over is because up until including the last shot, there's this, it's constantly showing Nixon through his like security cam photos of himself, like on these like blurry blue monitors. And I was like, well, clearly Altman is saying something here. I was just trying to figure out what
I took from it was that, in Altman's depiction of this character, he's got this camera pointed at him because he's still craving that attention. He's craving that light, that fame. He wants to be out there. He wants to be in the thick of it, which is, something that Nixon says in the next movie that we're going to talk about. He always wanted to, even after all of this terrible public shame that he got, and, he really jeopardized his whole political career with what he did with Watergate. Like, he still thought that he had a chance to like get back out there and get back into the game. So that's what I took from it, was just that he was hungry for it. So he, liked having the TV monitors on him because it reminded him when he had the whole world watching him. It's
really true. That's a good point. It's gotta be hard when you go out to a stadium or whatever of people screaming your name, and to think that like the whole world hangs on your every decision, as we saw in our 13 days and 7 days in May. Like, to go from that to irrelevance has got to be, it's got to be crushing. And obviously some people, Jimmy Carter managed to reinvent himself with like Habitat for Humanity, and some people I think managed to kind of find some sort of peace. But I think other people, it's got to be hard. It's really got to be hard to lose that. And,
it's like an athlete going out on a bad game, like it's an athlete being forced into retirement after having like one of the worst games of their career. And, he wants to get back out there and go, and make it up. But,
it's not going to happen. Well, that's the other thing, right? He's gone from somebody who's the most powerful person in the world to the helplessness, right? Like the one thing he can't do is he can't change his fate. The reason I think Nixon fascinates us is he really feels like a character out of a Greek tragedy. And he does remind me of Trump in that his own demons are what ultimately destroyed him. It's kind of like, I imagine that's like, again, what they wanted to, the goal of doing with House of Cards, or with some of these other kind of stories of like, the rise and fall of these sort of dark figures of history. Its own demons are really what did him in.
Yeah, with Trump, he feels like a sociopath or an egomaniac. With Nixon, for me, the more I read about Nixon or learn about Nixon, the more I want to learn. The more I learn about Nixon, the more I want to learn, because it's so fascinating. It's a crippling self-esteem issue with Nixon. Self-esteem issue, and he would just do everything he could to combat that. The last thing I'm going to say about this movie before we move on is just how impressive a work it is for Altman, because it's so anti-Altman. There's one actor.
Yeah, it really is.
One room, and it's 90 minutes. Those are all
one room
you would never find in a Robert Altman movie.
Right, it's short. It's one set. It's very stripped down. There's literally a Chekhov's gun. He pulls out a gun, and you keep thinking, is he going to shoot himself? Hey, what's going on? But then he doesn't really, spoiler alert, Nixon doesn't, as you can learn from Wikipedia, did not shoot himself in the head with a revolver.
Not literally, anyway.
Not literally, yeah. Metaphorically, with his own behavior. But again, like, you think, well, that's got to go somewhere, but it doesn't. It's so stripped down, and I almost feel like it's a filmmaker flex, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where he's like, look, I can do something with nothing.
Yeah.
Other people.
It's even shot on 16 millimeter. I think it's not even a 35 millimeter film.
Right. It's not like he's hiring Janusz Kaminski or, he's doing it with students. Maybe they're very talented. They seem like very talented students from what they produced, but he's not like hiring like these legendary crew people, cinematographers and all that. And yet it is utterly compelling.
Also utterly compelling is my next film, which is also about Mr. Richard Nixon, and that is Frost Nixon. And if you have not seen Frost Nixon, it is a dramatic retelling of the post-Watergate interviews between British talk show host David Frost and former President Richard Nixon, who we've been discussing. And it doesn't really sound like a great concept for a film or like super exhilarating. It's about a TV interview, but Ron Howard just knocks it out of the park. Ron Howard really does films about history. He really knocks it out of the park when it comes to that stuff. This man loves himself some history.
Yeah.
But what I love about this movie, again, as we've talked about, and as our audience can guess, as we go on and on about Richard Nixon, he just fascinates me. So I devour stuff about him. But what was really interesting about this film to me is you see that chip on his shoulder in this film. You see that regret in this film. You see that self-esteem issue in this film. You see like him trying to fight for all the good things he did and try and dismiss the horrible things that he did. But what you have is you also have David Frost, who's this character who's seemingly very different, but who can relate to him, and that's kind of like the twist of this film is you have two people who on paper have very little in common, but we learn and they learn that they actually have a lot in common. And what's great about this film is they also both have a lot at stake, and they're just going head to head in these like points in their lives, this crossroads in their lives, this crossroads in their career. And that, my friends, is drama at its finest.
Kind of like Secret Honor. I can't believe this movie works. Like it's about like really what seems like it should be a minor subject, which is, can this interview series work? Like, I mean, it feels like, compared to like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like I can't, how is this at all stakes? And yet he meticulously sets it up where you feel emotion, you understand at every point what's at stake, what you're hoping for, what the goal is, what the drama is, how it's humanly interacts with these characters. These characters, like you said, can't seem to be more different. David Frost seems like a dilettante. And, Nixon is, but he exudes charisma in a way that echoes maybe Nixon's rivalry with Kennedy. Yeah. Nixon is hardly has that charm, but he sees himself as a serious person. So they seem like opposites, and yet they both come from humble beginnings, and they're both trying to force their way back into the limelight after having been at the top and fallen from grace. And in the case of David Frost, from having a TV show in America, right? He was in New York, and Nixon from having, been the president of America. And it's really interesting. I remember watching this film the first time I watched it. And, Frank Langella, first of all, the two actors who play the leads, Michael Sheen, who I always love, and actually is part of the Tony Blair trilogy, if you like political films, The Queen, The Deal, The Special Relationship. Michael Sheen is amazing. And Frank Langella, who also is just one of the finest actors that's alive today.
This is his first of two appearances on our episode here today.
Oh yeah, that's true. He's also amazing. He's in one of my films. And I have to say, the interesting thing about when I first watched it is I kind of feel for the Frank Langella Richard Nixon. Like he seems like the sort of sad but kind of charming guy. Like he's got his own charm. He's not charming in the dashing playboy, jet-setting playboy way that Michael Sheen's character is, David Frost is, but he's got this sort of like homespun, kind of like funny little dry humor to him. Yeah. And you sort of feel for the guy. And I thought, well, maybe once I watch this in the post-Trump era, will I still feel that way? And I still sort of feel like I still watched it kind of feeling for Richard Nixon. You feel a certain sort of sympathy for him in the movie. And at some point I wondered, wait, are they going to make something like in 50 years from now? Are they going to make a movie about like Donald Trump like this, where you're just like, no, he's poor guy. He kind of has a charm to him. Because if so, I'm going to be really upset about that. Like, I wonder if I lived through it, like Richard Nixon, if I would have felt the same way.
Again, that's why I kind of talk about like with Nixon, there's things that you can connect to, like how he grew up. You can relate to that, or like having a chip on his shoulder and wanting to prove himself. Like you can relate to that, having fallen from grace. You can relate to that. With Trump, there's far less to relate to. Yeah. But Oliver Platt and Sam Rockwell play two research journalists who help David Frost in like compiling the questions and how they're going to attack Richard Nixon and how they're going to attack this interview. And they are fantastic in this. But there's this one great scene with Sam Rockwell ahead of the first interview taping. Oliver Platt and Sam Rockwell are looking out the window as Richard Nixon is getting out of the car. And Oliver Platt says, "Are you going to shake his hand?" And Sam Rockwell's character says, "Are you kidding me? no way I'm going to shake this man's hand. And Richard Nixon walks into the room and he's like shaking hands with everybody. And he comes up to Sam Rockwell's character and he's introduced, and Sam Rockwell just says, Mr. President, and shakes his hand. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, God damn, if Trump were in front of me, would I just cave and do the same thing? I'd like to think that I wouldn't, but
I wonder, you know what it made me think of? I met Bill Clinton once in my college, and obviously I'm more ideologically aligned with Bill Clinton than Richard Nixon or Donald Trump, but I supported Elizabeth Warren in the most recent primaries. It gives you a sense of where my politics lied. But still, I remember meeting him, and there's just a magnetism. Like every thought, a few of us got to meet him, got to shake his hand, and it's just there's a power to the presidency that just comes over you. And my mom, I told the story to my mom, and she said, I remember one time I was working at a hospital, and Ronald Reagan came there. And, you know, my mom is a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, like no fan of Ronald Reagan. But she said, I just saw him and I thought, I get it. I get why he won. Like some of these people, maybe they have the charisma, but maybe it's also that you know that they're the president. And there's just, I don't know what it is, but there is a power that comes over you. And I remember feeling it with Bill Clinton. Actually, you know who I met about a year ago is I met Kamala Harris too. And, you know, some of those people, they just have it.
Yeah, as we've talked about, it's just it's that power, and maybe it's once they get it, it's kind of all consuming, you know, and you carry it, you literally carry it around on your shoulders.
It really is. One of my favorite moments of this film is that Nixon, he's charming, he's surprisingly funny, and you feel like all of his crimes are sort of a distant echo, except for one moment when he says, roll the tape, and they play footage from the Vietnam War. And it was like it snapped me back to reality. Yeah. And I you know, one of my best friends is Cambodian. And what Nixon did with Operation Menu and the illegal bombing of Cambodia was, I don't even know what word to describe it. What happened was horrific.
It's an atrocity.
Yeah. And to think about the ramifications and what it led to and the echo throughout history. And Nixon, suddenly, this character, which had been charming for the whole movie, I felt myself turning against him because he would sit there in his chair all confident. And, you know, the whole drama is, oh, he's such a slippery figure and he's an experienced political combatant and he knows how to like outbox David Frost. But I started out prior to that moment feeling like, oh yeah, there's something impressive about it. Like this old political warhorse getting back in the game and showing he still got it. But at that moment, I suddenly thought this sophistry is just games. Whether you win this interview with David Frost or not, you still did these monstrous things.
Yes. And I think it's very intentional with this script and with this film. And that's why this movie, I think, is so good because it plays the audience so perfectly.
Yeah.
It pulls you in, you know, like Frank Langella's character pulls you in, you know, and it kind of coerces you and you want to shake his hand too a little. You know, and then once we as the audience, as we see that scene, it's meant to snap us out of it and be like, okay, all right, you did this really awful, god awful stuff, and that's the point where the movie kind of turns, and it's just it's really really well crafted of Ron Howard and the writer to pull it off and to save that punch, to save that left hook for right at that moment. It's really incredible.
I will say, by the way, I went back and I watched some of the Frost Nixon interviews, and I do think Frank Langella adds a certain percentage of charm. I did not find real life Richard Nixon nearly as charming in those interviews as I found Frank Langella.
You actually watch the Frost Nixon interviews; they're not nearly as entertaining as this movie is.
No.
It's a credit to Ron Howard.
It's a credit, yes, it really is. And honestly, so the two performers, Michael Sheen and Frank Langella, are just mesmerizing, their moments together. The other thing I thought, by the way, in the end, the film kind of argues that the significance of this moment was that it kind of gave us the confession. It gave us the pain that the country was so craving from Nixon that it hadn't gotten. But then I thought, well, if we really were satisfied, why was Robert Altman making Secret Honor?
Well, that's the thing. It's like, I mean, David, you and I weren't even alive. And we've just been talking about Richard Nixon for 45 minutes. Nixon there's something that just grabs America's attention about this man. There are more movies about Richard Nixon than any other American president, because I was looking at a lot of presidential movies while we were prepping this episode, and there are so many movies about Richard Nixon. And that's why you see so many people just fascinated. Like Hunter S. Thompson is completely obsessed, or was completely obsessed with Richard Nixon, even though he despised the man. You know, there's something about him that, and we'll move on and stop comparing him. But, the same thing with Trump is like, what are people going to do when they don't have Trump to obsess over next week?
Right. But Richard Nixon, who achieved electoral success that Trump could only dream of, was a much more, in his own strange way, seductive of a figure. And I think it's a warning sign that we can be seduced by his intelligence and his pathos and the tragic aspects of him. But I think the film kind of points out there's a risk that in the danger of being sucked into the power and the spell of a figure like Nixon, we can lose the stories of the people who were victimized by him. We can lose the story of the country.
And that's what's more important.
Yeah. And that's exactly that moment when James Reston, played by Sam Rockwell, he knows the magnitude of Nixon's crimes, and yet he forgets it in that moment. And he can only shake his hand and say, "Hello, Mr. President." There's a danger in Nixon, too. I think, like you said, it's become this figure, this cottage industry almost of analyzing Nixon. And we should. I mean, he's a fascinating figure, but there's a risk that we can lose the voices of those people who are not as powerful and whose stories are just as tragic, but not stories of tragic downfalls done to themselves by themselves, but of tragic pain wrought by this man. You always have to keep that in mind too. I'm only realizing this now. When I think about what's one of the powers of what this film is arguing is that you can't ever lose sight of the consequences of these figures. It's not a game. As much as it feels like a game, he's constantly saying, "I love being back in the arena,"
Right.
I'm going to go joust with David Frost. It's not a game. As 13 Days points out very crisply, this is life or death. And this is not about whether you're the wittiest debater. It's about the people who live and die on your watch. And that's really the ultimate judge of a president, not whether you can win a debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Milhouse Nixon, Secret Honor and Frost Nixon. I think it would make a great double feature.
Yes.
Secret Honor is available to rent on all streaming platforms. Rent it at your local video store. Frost Nixon is available right now on Netflix. Check them both out, and I recommend checking them out within close proximity of each other because, like I said, there's so many films on Richard Nixon. I think these two are my favorite personally, and I was happy we were able to talk about them today. We're going to take a quick break, everybody. When we come back, David and I are going to give our final presidential films. Don't go anywhere. Film Forward returns after this.
Hello, I'm Sonia, and this is my Movie Minute. This week I want to talk about Robert Altman's Nashville, released in 1975. This movie is just so friggin' great. I had put off watching it due to the almost 3-hour runtime, but the time flies by, and ultimately it left me wishing it was longer. Altman is the master of the ensemble cast and interweaving storylines. And in Nashville, that's on proud display, as there are 24 characters that we follow and get to know over the course of 2 hours and 40 minutes. The cast is incredible, star-studded, and do all their own singing. Some also wrote their own songs. Nashville, like the actual city, is very American in both fantastic and hideous ways. I wouldn't say the film is pro or anti-America. I would say that it's honest. Sometimes it's really upsetting. Sometimes it's beautiful, but it's always compelling, and the music is great. The film seems to say that when music is playing, all of our other cares fall away. One of the main characters, a folk singer named Barbara Jean, is basically unable to function on her own. She seems frail, ill, and unstable. But when she starts to sing, everything comes together and all of her pain seems to fall away. The power of music is also evident in the final moments of the film. At an event, something horrible and tragic has just happened, and it seems like anything good is now gone. But then a woman gets on stage and begins singing a song that goes, "You may say that I ain't free, but it don't worry me." The woman singing becomes more and more enthusiastic and unbridled as she repeats the lines over and over. Then she's accompanied by an African-American gospel choir, and soon everyone in the crowd is singing along, including me in my living room. It's such an incredible closing sequence. I could go on and on. and talk about every scene in the film, but that was my minute. Go watch Nashville, and thanks for listening.
And we are back on Film Forward, everybody. I'm here with Mr. David Chiu, and we are doing our Gimme Three thing. Gimme Three Presidential Films, and celebratory of our new president. David's picks so far, 7 Days in May and Secret Honor. And my picks so far have been 13 Days and Frost Nixon. And now it's time for our final recommendations. David, your last but not least pick is...
Well, you mentioned our new president, so I felt like I wanted to pick a movie that reflected more Joe Biden than just sticking on Donald Trump, right? Like I wanted this last film to kind of transition us into the future. And, you know, it's hard to say. Joe Biden's presidency hasn't started yet, but what I imagine Joe Biden to be most like, and what I imagine he could become or he could represent, is Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. And my film pick is All the Way. It was an HBO adaptation of a play by the same title. I actually had the chance to see the play on Broadway.
Nice.
It was a real treat to see Bryan Cranston, fresh off Breaking Bad, play this incredible performance. And I was curious to see how it would be adapted to film. And indeed, as the screenwriter, I think it's Robert Schenken, had said, he didn't want to just make a filmed version of the play. He wanted to play to the strengths of the medium of film. And indeed, it doesn't feel like just a filmed play. It feels like it plays. It feels like it really plays to the strengths of a film, like you said, like a movie, even though it may not have the budget of 13 days. What it tells the story of is Lyndon Baines Johnson, right after the assassination of John Kennedy, up until his election in his own right as president. So it's less than a year of time between Kennedy's death and I think it's like 11 months, if I recall. And it ends on election night when Johnson has won one of the largest margins in history and gone from what he says at the beginning, I don't want to be just the accidental president. And he sort of proves himself as a president in his own right. And Johnson, you know, he's a complicated figure in his own way. I mean, he comes from very modest origins, you know, the hill country of Texas, as he says. He's a real like visionary figure. He really understands poverty. He really feels the cause of civil rights in his core, and yet he comes from the limits of his worldview. He has no problem trading away voting rights initially, believing we could get later. You know, his opening monologue is talking about like his ancestors hiding from Comanches.
Right.
Which, I'm sure they did, but like there's a reason why the Comanches were upset.
There's a little reason. Yeah.
Right. And then like that's the limits of the figure, right? And it's really worth noting that like Kamala Harris, Joe Biden's vice president, in her first debate with Joe Biden, it said like, look, you were palling around with these segregationists talking about the good old days when we worked with them, but these were the people who were opposing these policies. Like, we were opposing busing and such. That this is what enabled me to go to school. That little girl was me, she said really famously. Mm-hmm. And so there's this sense, there's a part where LBJ kind of tries to like, was it the term white-splain to Martin Luther King? Like, did you know that like black people have places, they can't stop at hotels like on their way
right.
to the South? Like, I believe MLK is well aware of that, And yet he also LBJ brings this tremendous institutional knowledge as a creature of the Senate to bear to being able to get this legislation passed when it seems really hopeless. That legislation has never been able to be passed. And it takes somebody of such tremendous political skills to be able to do that, to pass the civil rights legislation through Congress that, despite the objections of Southern conservative Democrats in his own party, mm-hmm. and to be able to straddle the liberal wing represented by Hubert Humphrey with the conservative wing represented by, folks like Richard Russell, who's played by Frank Langella, and somehow to be able to like move through that and also make the hard choices and to make the strategic decisions, say, maybe, to be able to say, well, we'll have to save voting rights for another go around. But also, the other thing that this film points out is it's really, like, if you look at the poster, it's really a two-hander, as they say in the business, right? It's LBJ and MLK.
Yeah.
And Anthony Mackie does an amazing job. And what does this really show is that it's not just about one man. There's a danger in these stories of the president of being seduced into thinking it's about some hero on a white horse coming to save the day. And indeed, some people have criticized progressives, or certainly the Democrats, for becoming very enchanted with Obama and kind of expecting him to kind of solve it all, right?
Right.
And the lesson is that it's a partnership between activists outside the government and people working inside the government. And sometimes you're working together and sometimes you're pushing each other uncomfortably. But that's what makes change happen. It's not just one magic guy who's going to do it. And indeed, there's this great line that Martin Luther King Jr. says at the end of the film, where he says, they said, "Do you really believe he's going to fulfill his promise to finally get that voting rights legislation?" And he says, "Look, he's just another politician worried about his reelection. It's up to us."
Right.
To push him. And that's what I really feel like I want the message of people to take away as we enter this next presidency. Look, if you didn't like Donald Trump, and this conversation makes clear I didn't like Donald Trump, there's a dangerous temptation to say, well, the bad man is out of the White House. I can finally relax. And yeah, it's been exhausting. But like, when I think about the mobilization of activists, of energy, of people pushing for change, whether it was to save the Affordable Health Care Act, whether it was to help win the midterms or the general election, whether it was the people who knocked on doors or the people who called and wrote letters or raised money from small donors, or who stood up to legislators and made their voice heard at town halls and at congressional hearings and in the halls of Congress in peaceful but in powerful ways, we need to make that happen even when somebody we don't so strongly oppose is the president. Maybe somebody who, it's even more important to do it when it's somebody who we see as sort of more of an ideological ally, because that's the kind of person who's going to be the most responsive.
Yes, the most receptive to the change.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the mess. There's a powerful message, unlike 13 Days, which really, you see the image of Kennedy as one man alone. It all rests on his shoulders. And, that's an important image too. And there maybe are certain decisions where it really is a very lonely moment. But All the Way really argues that the presidency is actually ironically bigger than one person. Yeah. And presidents are flawed people. I mean, LBJ he's not treated with the same degree of, he's talking about the ending moment of 13 Days. He's not treated with the same degree of reverence that 13 Days treats Kennedy. Like, he seems at the end, he's like sort of celebrating that he won. Like, I'm the president, like he's this sort of power hungry, he's not power hungry in the Nixonian way, but he's definitely somebody
he's definitely power hungry. This movie lays that out pretty thick.
It lays it out pretty thick. He's got some of his biases. There's a heartbreaking moment where one of his closest aides is busted for soliciting sex from another man, or engaging in sex with another man in a men's restroom. And LBJ just throws him under the bus. Just like, well, we got to cut him loose. Like, there's coldly. And even his wife is like, we can't abandon him. He's been our friend. And LBJ, he's like, no, he's got to win this election. So he's willing to let this guy, and you see him in the film, who's faithfully served him and has been like a best friend and a confidant, like a son to him, cuts him loose in a second. So it doesn't portray LBJ as this paragon of progressive ideals. But I think that's a really important message, that these aren't perfect people. They're politicians.
I really love the kind of mirroring of LBJ and Martin Luther King, not as characters or people themselves, but with the conflicts that they have to face. Martin Luther King Jr.'s faced with a lot of these dilemmas and conflicts as well. He's got to get these incremental victories through because he knows they're important, but he has to answer to the organizations that he's working with and the people who are risking and giving their lives for this movement. He's got to go back to them and say, well, we didn't get voting rights now, but we're going to get it. Don't worry. He's got to play those battles, the same kind of battles that LBJ's playing. And so I thought it was really fascinating to
yeah, you realize he's in his own way a politician. He's balancing like you said, he's mirroring LBJ's balancing coalitions, whether it's Stokely Carmichael and Ben Moses, who are more progressive, who are more chomping at the bit to make change, or Roy Wilkins, who's more institutional, representing the NAACP.
You know, that scene at the Democratic National Convention of 64, they're outside Atlantic City and they're fighting for delegate votes. And they give them a measly 2 votes, and one of them had to be delivered by a white
one of the white guy,
And all the, leaders of these coalitions and these organizations are looking at MLK and they're saying, what should we do? Should we take these measly 2 votes? And he says, yeah, we should take them, even though, it's not as much as we want. And it may be a little bit of a slap to the face. In the background, you have these protesters who are chanting, which side are you on? I just thought it was a really... Right. It was a little on the nose, but I thought it was well done. It was
well done. And you got the idea that, like, MLK said, look, it's not about the votes. I mean, it is. And you see his heart broke for not being able to get more. But he said, we also got a promise to, like, all future delegations can't be segregated.
Right.
And so he's like, I'm playing the long game. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice was one of Barack Obama's favorite quotes from MLK. And that's certainly... You can see he's playing this long game, and it's tough. It's really challenging. And you can see the tremendous pressure that he's under, trying to, like, kind of like JFK, knowing that the wrong move could be disastrous.
Right.
I will say it's really poignant at the end. LBJ wins, you can look it up. He won a resounding, crushing victory. However, the South used to be the base of the Democratic Party. I mean, worth noting, in the Civil War, the Democrats were the Southerners.
Right.
And they lose the South. That's the one place LBJ, a Southerner, loses.
Yeah, this is the turning of the tide you're seeing in this film.
Right. And there's a moment he's talking to Richard Russell, who is this, storied senator from Georgia. And he says, Georgia voted for a Republican. It's never done that in its history. And there's this sort of dark illusion that, like, the price of civil rights has been, you will pay a price for doing the right thing at the ballot box. And it's really poignant, again, to watch this film in a moment when he says, oh yeah, Georgia, it voted for the Republican because of LBJ's push for civil rights. And we're having this conversation after Georgia has voted for a Democrat. I believe it might be the first time since LBJ. I'm not sure. I think it is. Carter, I think, was also.
Oh, Jimmy Carter. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and maybe Bill Clinton. So
actually, says in the movie, he's like, "They'll be back," and
they'll be back. Well, they were. But not only that, 2 of elect. So I believe they did vote for 2 other Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. So it's not as big a stretch as I thought initially, but it's still significant.
Yeah.
But that they voted for as their 2 senators, a young white Jewish man and a black preacher.
Right.
As their new senators. And indeed, that feels like...
Of Martin Luther King's church, a preacher of Martin Luther King's church.
Right.
Before we move on, I just want to give a shameless plug. This movie, I think, would make a great pairing with MLK FBI, which is available in virtual cinemas right now. It's an incredible documentary by the legendary Sam Pollard, and it goes even more in depth into J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI's government surveillance on Martin Luther King Jr. And I learned a lot watching that documentary. And I just had the esteemed honor of interviewing Sam Pollard talking about MLK FBI. And that episode of Film Forward is available, the previous episode before this one. So check out that episode and check out MLK FBI. It makes a great pairing with this movie.
I am excited to check it out. It really piqued my interest, the story of how much MLK was surveilled by Hoover, a man with his own demons, as we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the way. It's a great watch. As we mentioned, Bryan Cranston, he disappears into this role, not like 10, 15 minutes into it, from the first frame. And probably because, as you mentioned, he was LBJ, on Broadway before this movie. So he was in it. But the film is available on HBO Max. Highly recommend it. And now, so we're going to go into my final film. And if you're looking to get out of stuffy offices and old white men in shirts and ties, we got a nice change of pace for you here. I've got South Side with You as my final pick. And it is about the first date between Michelle Robinson and Barack Obama. It's actually not a date. Michelle makes that very clear, that this is not a date. They are law colleagues, and the plan is to attend a community event, which they do. But Sly Barack has also, some other plans. The film takes place all in one day. Barack picks up Michelle. They check out some beautiful art. They have some good eats. They go to this community event, and Michelle is in awe of Barack as he talks to these people who are going through some tough times about the community center. And you get to see a young Barack in action, and you get to you feel that electricity that he has in a room. And then I'm not really giving too much away because this is all kind of like this. Most of this actually happened, but they finish off the date by going to see a film that we talked about the last time David was on our show.
Right.
Do the Right Thing, which is my favorite film. But that's how they finished their first day, by going to see Do the Right Thing. I really love this film. I just think it's wonderful. It's very patient. It takes its time and calmly pulls you in, but it never feels slow. It just ropes you in. It brings you in, and it kind of soothes you, kind of like Obama itself. The movie says
yeah, that's true. I didn't think about that. It really is true. It's like Obama himself.
It's got a very Obama cadence. Barack Obama's presidency is not perfect, but he's my favorite president, mostly because I just relate to his story a lot. Growing up as a multiracial man and kind of feeling like you're, stuck in between two races, and, you don't really have a quote unquote home, is something that I relate to, and something that he, alludes to in his books a lot. It's touched on in this movie. It's touched on a lot more in the film Barry, which is not as good as this movie, in my opinion, but it's still, it's worth a watch. It's kind of something both of these characters are going through in this film. And Michelle mentions it, like going to work at this law firm that they're at. She talks about leaving Planet Black, living in the South Side, and entering Planet White. The other thing that I find really fascinating about this movie is you go into it thinking you're going to be watching this really cute, uplifting, romantic movie about Michelle and Barack first meeting and love at first sight and all this stuff. But it's really Michelle and Barack challenging each other and challenging each other's place in the world. And it's about two young people just trying to figure out their place in the world. They both want to do good. They both want to do more. They both want to help people, and they recognize that in each other. But they both have some stuff that they're battling through, which is something that I think we can all relate to, where I certainly can. So it's really a deviation from all of these other films that we've talked about, but it's a beautiful grassroots look at, what a president was before he was president and a first lady, what they were like before they were president. And I'm not saying that those other people weren't like this, but the reason I love Obama so much is just because he feels like somebody I know, he feels like a person. And maybe this is me being naive and, bring on the hate mail, whatever. But I don't feel like he was a power hungry person like some of the other presidents that we've talked about in this episode.
Yeah, I relate to everything you're saying. I also am a mixed race person. I remember when I first read I came across his book Dreams for My Father when he was running for president. And I remember...
sorry to interrupt. I grew up without a father. So that was another reason why I related to his story. Was we both kind of had that home, no race, no father. It's...
wow. That's intense. I mean, that I fortunately am able to have my dad in my life. So I can't imagine what that must be like. But I definitely related to him being in two different worlds and kind of finding your identity. And again, look, I don't think any president is going to be exactly what you want that president to be. Mm-hmm. They're always going to do something a little different than what you think they should do. Because everybody, you have your own opinions. That's good. We should all have our own opinions. I agree with you. Barack Obama, as I look at it right now, I'm not really sure I'm going to see another president. Maybe I will, who's going to resonate with me in the same way that Obama did. Maybe he's the one like JFK and your grandmother putting JFK on the wall and really relating to him. all those years later. Like I was like, maybe that Barack Obama is that for me. Like there was something generationally, something outlook-wise, something about his own perspective and what he represented to the country, about a new and evolving and a changing country. There was something that he represented that was maybe even bigger than Barack Obama the man.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because the film is really about Barack Obama the man. That he's a very ordinary person in this film. Like he's got certain skills. You certainly see he's got, like you said, incredible rhetorical abilities, but he's kind of a regular, like you can kind of imagine him. He's driving this beat up old car that has a hole in the bottom.
Right.
Chain smoking. They kind of do what you would imagine a day. It's certainly not JFK romancing, some young women on his yacht, millionaire yacht or whatever his upbringing was. It was a very ordinary kind of upbringing. And so you can imagine yourself going on a date with somebody at that scene at the bar where they're just sitting at the bar talking. And at some point you think, wow, that's going to be the president and the first lady. But they're just kind of wondering what their futures are about. And they're really not sure. Like Barack Obama, he's not saying, well, I'm going to be the president. You know what I mean? He's not, like you said, it doesn't seem like there's that ambition.
He's not even sure he's going to get into politics. He just wants to do something more, is what they talk about. He wants to do something to help people.
Now, I don't know. I mean, is that Obama? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there is an ambitious streak to him. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some sort of Obama. One of Obama's quotes that I really love. This is actually one of the reasons I really like Obama, as he said, I'm somebody who ran for president, so I have a pretty healthy ego.
Right?
Like he's very down. He's very keeps it real. So, but there's sort of an incredible charm of just like you said, two young people trying to find their way in the world. And my goodness, after the 4 years we've been on, and after the dark stories that we've told, whether they're stories of nuclear annihilation or government coups, or the stories of embittered presidents who resigned in disgrace, or even the tough battles, just to give people basic human dignity. And certainly after 4 years of what feels like it's been a nightmare, to just be able to end on end up on this note, and to just for a short amount of time escape into a world that's not naive to the struggles. Like you said, Michelle Obama struggles with being a Black woman in a law firm dominated by white men. Yeah. And you see that. And Barack Obama certainly is trying to figure himself out between two worlds and what he wants to do. So it's not naive. Mm-mm. But to be able to kind of end with people, like good people dreaming of doing good, is just such a breath of fresh air.
There are three things that the Barack character and the Michelle character are like battling with in their lives. And I think it's three words that I will leave you with on this podcast, because I think they sum up this country. They can sum up the presidency as a position. The words are judgment, anger, and forgiveness. Those are the themes of this film that are kind of like very internal as we follow these characters through this day as they try and find themselves and kind of confide in each other. I think they're words that we need to, I'm not saying abide by, but I think we need to consider them as we move into this post-Trump era. And I'm not saying we need to forgive Trump, but we need to forgive some people if we're going to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I wonder how we're going to, right now I'm reading a book on the history of the 30 years after the Civil War, because I find myself wondering, thankfully we haven't gotten to that part, but we've gotten to, some pretty scary, violent divides. And I thought, man, how did this country put itself back together? And the sobering answer is it wasn't actually that easy. There was still violence. Even when Black folks got the vote in southern states, people threatened to murder them if they didn't vote for the Democrat. Again, that was the sort of the Southern power-based party at the time.
Some would argue that it never really put itself back together.
Right. And so we see those echoes. And Barack and Michelle are dealing with that. They're dealing with this as... It's interesting that Barack Obama is there. He doesn't get to live in a world with President Barack Obama.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that at some point. Like, he doesn't know that he is yet possible. They're both young Black folks hoping that somehow they can find a way through this world, and grateful for the advantages they have, and yet somehow feeling like there needs to be more. And that's, like you said, it's very relatable.
And hopefully, for all the kids who are listening to this podcast, which is our demographic, ages 7 to 14, that's our main demographic. They now know that they can do it. There was a Barack Obama. So, hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, lead the way, do it with good. Don't do it for the power. Do it with love in your heart and for the good of the nation, which, when it's at its best, I still believe, and maybe it's naive of me. This is the dumb, naive American Nicholas Ybarra speaking to my audience right now and admitting it. When this country is at its best, I do honestly believe, with tears in my eyes, I say it can be the greatest country in the world.
Yeah. I remember people would say, if he wins a second term, I'm going to go live somewhere else, right? And I remember people saying that to me. And I remember just thinking, like, I don't know. I mean, I guess the world is filled with refugees, and never let us be so confident to think we can't one day become them. But I remember every time I would hear it, I would think, I can't imagine. I love going to other places, but I'm an American. That's just, it's like being part of a family. There's things about your family you love. There's things about your family that frustrate you. There's people in your family that you love, that you're related to, and there's people in your family that you're like, oh man, we're really stuck with each other, aren't we? But they're your family.
Yeah,
it's who you are.
It's who you are.
It's who makes you you. And I just, this country is that for me. It's my family. It's who I am. It's deep down embedded to my core is I'm an American. As we look back on these presidents, some built some good, some built some pretty dark things. Some was kind of a Richard Nixon, EPA and Title IX, but also, like we said, Cambodia and Watergate and all those things. But presidents are a symbol. They're a symbol of this country. And I think this film, Southside with You, it captured this idea that Barack Obama could be a symbol of maybe our hopes for a better America, an America of progress, an America of equality. But I suppose our presidents are as complicated as our country is. And we're all just going to try and have to build the one that, like you said, is based on hope and not on fear. Build the one we dream of.
All right, those are some great films, y'all. Definitely check those out. And we definitely got to bring David on this new version of the podcast. We got so many amazing guests we got to bring on this new iteration of the Gimme Three podcast. He is awesome. As I said before, make sure you go out and vote if you haven't already. Be safe, and no matter what happens tomorrow, remember, love and respect each other. We're all Americans. We're all in this together. And as always, we want to hear from you. What do you think of these great films that we discussed today? What do you think of our show? Let us know. You can do that by messaging us on Instagram at the Gimme Three Podcast. That's GIMME, spell out 3 podcast. Type in Gimme Three Podcast into the Instagram search menu. You can click on us. You can follow us. You can DM us. You can also send us a text message by scrolling down to the episode description and clicking the link that says send us a text message. Drop us a line because we would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to this Gimme Three podcast, and we will see you at the movies.